The small town of Ridgewater was known for its stillness. Tucked away in a forested valley, it wasn't the kind of place that made the news. The local police force was a skeleton crew, just 5 officers handling the occasional drunk, a lost dog, or a dispute over property lines. That was until the summer of 1997. It began with a 911 call from the outskirts of town. A man named Harold Bentley, a retired steelworker, reported screams coming from the woods behind his property. He described them as unnatural, like someone was being tortured. 2 officers were dispatched, Sergeant Ron Heller, a seasoned veteran, and Officer Dana Griggs, fresh out of the academy. They arrived at Harold's property just before dusk, a thick, unsettling fog creeping in through the trees. Harold led them to the edge of the forest, flashlight shaking in his hand. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The officers entered the woods, their radios crackling with static as they ventured further. They found nothing, no signs of struggle, no wildlife, not even the usual sounds of crickets or birds. Heller assured Harold it was likely a prank or an animal in distress and told him to call again if it happened. But Harold never had the chance. The next morning, his neighbor found him dead in his front yard, his face frozen in a rictus of terror. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but rumors spread. Some claimed his door had been scratched from the outside, deep gouges that no animal could have made. Over the next week, the screams returned, reported by various residents near the forest. Each time, officers were sent to investigate, and each time they found nothing. The town's mood grew tense, suspicion blooming like a poisonous flower. People started locking their doors, keeping their children close, and whispering about the forest watcher, an old legend about a malevolent presence said to haunt the woods. Then Officer Griggs disappeared. She had been patrolling near the forest when dispatch lost contact with her. Backup arrived within minutes, finding her cruiser abandoned by the roadside, the engine still running. The driver's door was open, her flashlight discarded on the ground. The only clue was a single set of footprints leading into the forest, barefoot and impossibly large. The entire police force, along with volunteers, combed the woods for days but found no sign of her. The case made regional news, but interest waned when no new leads surfaced. Ridgewater grew quieter, the kind of quiet that made every creek and shadow feel sinister. Months passed, and then the final act of the nightmare began. Sergeant Heller, the officer who had been with Griggs during the first investigation, started behaving strangely. He became withdrawn and paranoid, refusing to talk about the case. He was seen wandering the woods at odd hours, his eyes hollow and his movements jerky, as if he were a puppet on strings. His wife told neighbors that he would wake up screaming, his body drenched in sweat, mumbling about the thing in the dark. One night, Heller went on duty and never returned. His squad car was found near the forest, much like Griggs had been, the driver's door wide open. This time, there were no footprints, no clues, just a chilling void. The department was paralyzed with fear. 2 officers quit within days, leaving the town effectively unprotected. Months later, a group of hikers stumbled upon a gruesome discovery deep in the woods. They found what remained of Heller, his body twisted and contorted in a way that defied explanation. Nearby, they found fragments of a police badge, Griggs. Both items were covered in a thick, black substance that no lab could identify. The woods were officially declared off-limits, but the screams continued. Those who lived closest began moving away, leaving Ridgewater a ghost town within a decade. To this day, the case files remain open, but untouched, collecting dust in the county archives. Unexplained calls still come in from the area, reports of lights flickering in the trees and voices calling for help. But no officer will go there, not after what happened to Heller and Griggs. The only thing left to do is wonder what waits in the shadows of Ridgewater's woods, and pray it never steps beyond the trees. In the winter of 2003, the town of Black Hollow, a mining settlement nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, became the site of an event so horrifying that even the hardened state police refused to speak of it. It wasn't a place where much happened. The locals were tough, close-knit, and mistrustful of outsiders. They had lived in the shadow of the mountains for generations, their lives entwined with the eerie stillness of the wilderness. On a bitterly cold night in late December, a call came into the Black Hollow Sheriff's Office. It was garbled, but the dispatcher could make out frantic screams and the words, "He's here." The call ended abruptly, and when the dispatcher tried to trace it, the signal led to a single address, a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. Deputy Claire Matheson and Sheriff Ed Collar were dispatched to investigate. The cabin belonged to the Pickman family, an elderly couple who had lived there for decades without incident. When the officers arrived, they found the front door swinging open in the icy wind. The cabin was dark except for a faint orange glow seeping out from beneath the basement door. Inside, the air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of copper and damp wood. The walls were scratched with deep gouges, and something that looked like symbols had been scrawled in a brownish-red substance that neither officer wanted to identify. They called out for the Pickmans, but received no reply. Sheriff Collar, armed with his flashlight and sidearm, motioned for Matheson to stay behind while he descended the stairs to the basement. The creaking steps groaned under his weight as the orange glow intensified. Matheson strained to hear, her hand gripping her service pistol tightly. Suddenly, the sheriff let out a guttural screaming that was cut short. Matheson called his name, her voice trembling, but the only response was a low, wet, gurgling sound. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she descended the stairs. The basement was empty except for a single overturned chair and a large iron furnace in the corner. The orange glow was coming from inside it. The sheriff was gone. No sign of him, just his flashlight lying on the floor and his radio hissing with static. Matheson backed away, her eyes fixed on the furnace. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard the faint sound of scratching behind her. She didn't turn around. She ran. When backup arrived hours later, they found no trace of the Pickmans, the sheriff, or even Deputy Matheson herself. The only evidence that remained was her squad car, its engine idling in the snow, and the cabin itself. The basement door was shut, the symbols on the walls gone as if scrubbed clean, but the furnace was still warm. 2 months later, hikers stumbled upon a gruesome scene deep in the woods. A circle of skeletal remains, each one arranged in a grotesque display of worship. At the center of the circle was the sheriff's badge, burned black. Investigators determined the bones were human, belonging not only to the Pickmans, but also to several individuals reported missing over the years. The case was closed as an unsolved mystery. But locals whispered that the Pickman cabin was cursed, haunted by something ancient and malevolent that had been disturbed long before the Pickmans moved in. The cabin was demolished by the county a year later, but the land remains untouched. Hikers who venture too close often report hearing whispers, soft and unintelligible, but always accompanied by the faint scent of burning wood. Some claim to have seen a dim orange glow in the distance, flickering like a furnace, drawing them in. Most never go back. Those who do are never the same. They speak of eyes in the darkness and the sensation of being watched, always from behind. No one dares linger long enough to see if the whispers turn into screams. In the fall of 1988, the Pinecrest County Sheriff's Department received a series of reports about a stretch of desolate highway known as Route 39. Travelers claimed to have seen a woman standing on the roadside, barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress. Most described her as staring blankly into the distance, but a few swore she turned to look directly at them, her eyes empty sockets. The first officer to investigate was Deputy Alan Hughes, a young man eager to prove himself. He dismissed the reports as urban legends, stories meant to scare late-night drivers. But on the evening of October 15th, Hughes himself made the call that changed everything. His voice on the radio was frantic, stuttering. She's here. She's just standing there. I don't know what. She's not moving. No face. No face. Oh, God. The transmission cut off abruptly. Backup arrived 20 minutes later to find Hughes's cruiser parked on the shoulder, the driver's door open, the engine running. His flashlight lay on the ground, flickering weakly. Hughes was gone, his service pistol left on the passenger seat. The only trace of him was a set of muddy footprints leading into the dense woods. A week later, Officer Laura Price was assigned to patrol Route 39. She wasn't thrilled about it. Hughes was still missing, and the rumors among the department had grown unsettling. Some officers whispered about the faceless woman, an old Pinecrest ghost story. Price didn't believe in ghosts, but the disappearances gnawed at her nerves. That night, just past midnight, Price's dash cam captured what would later be reviewed with growing dread. She was driving slowly, scanning the roadside, when the camera caught a figure standing near the edge of the woods. A woman, pale and gaunt, wearing a filthy white dress. Her face was turned toward the camera, but her features were distorted, like a smudged painting. Then, in a single jerky motion, the woman began walking toward the car. Price radioed for assistance, her voice calm but strained. "I've got a visual. Looks like a woman. Possibly distressed. I'm stopping to investigate." The video recorded her stepping out of the cruiser, flashlight in hand, and calling out to the woman. "Ma'am, do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She stopped moving, standing completely still. Price moved closer, her flashlight trembling slightly. The beam illuminated the woman's face, or what should have been her face. There was nothing there. Smooth skin stretched where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The video ended there. Price's cruiser was found the next morning, the lights still flashing. Like Hughes, she had vanished, and a single set of footprints led from her car into the woods. In the following weeks, sightings of the faceless woman multiplied. Calls flooded the sheriff's department, each one more chilling than the last. One trucker claimed she had appeared in his rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat of his cab. A family driving through Pinecrest swore they saw her standing in the middle of the road, her hands raised as if beckoning them to stop. When they didn't, she appeared again 2 miles down the road, closer this time. A final incident sealed Route 39's fate. On Halloween night, a group of high school students dared each other to drive the road and stop where the sightings were most frequent. They live-streamed the event, laughing and joking, the camera bouncing as they drove along the dark stretch. The laughter stopped when one of them screamed. The camera showed her standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. The driver froze, unwilling to move closer. The woman raised a hand, pointing directly at the car. The video ended abruptly when the camera fell to the floor, recording only muffled screams and the sound of shattering glass. The car was found the next morning, abandoned and wrapped around a tree. There were no signs of the students, only their cell phones left behind, each one containing the same last recording. A photo of the faceless woman standing just outside the driver's window. Today, Route 39 is officially closed, marked by rusting barricades and faded warning signs. Locals avoid it completely, even during the day. But every so often, a brave or foolish soul ventures down the cursed road, drawn by curiosity or disbelief. Few return. Those who do often refuse to talk about what they saw. But if you listen to the wind near Route 39, some say you can still hear faint whispers, soft and mournful, echoing from the woods. And if you're very unlucky, you might see her, waiting, watching, faceless. In the spring of 1995, the small desert town of Dunewell became the epicenter of a chilling mystery that has since been whispered about only in hushed tones. Dunewell was little more than a speck on the map. A town with one diner, one gas station, and a sheriff's office with 3 officers. The townsfolk prided themselves on their quiet existence, far from the chaos of larger cities. But everything changed when a man stumbled into town one early morning, covered in blood and dust, mumbling incoherently about the Shadow Man. He collapsed at the steps of the diner before he could say more. Sheriff Marcus Harlan was the first to arrive. The man was alive, but barely coherent, his eyes darting to every corner of the room as though he expected something to emerge from the shadows. His clothes were torn, his shoes completely gone, and his hands were raw and blistered. When he finally spoke clearly, his words chilled everyone in the room. "He's in the sand. He watches from the sand. Don't let him see you." Harlan tried to question him further, but the man succumbed to his injuries before help could arrive. What stood out most was that his driver's license, found in his pocket, listed an address in New York, thousands of miles away. How had he ended up wandering barefoot in the middle of a desert? The sheriff decided to investigate the man's path. He, along with his deputy, Caroline Reyes, and a volunteer tracker named Bill Cartwright, followed the faint trail of footprints the man had left behind. It led them to a stretch of desert outside town, a place the locals referred to as Whispering Dunes. The area was avoided by nearly everyone, partly due to local legends of strange phenomena, voices carried on the wind, shadows that didn't match their surroundings, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. As they ventured deeper into the dunes, the team found more signs of the man's frantic flight: discarded clothing, bloodstains, and claw marks in the sand as if he had been dragged but managed to escape. The farther they went, the quieter it became. The usual desert sounds, wind, insects, the occasional coyote, vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then they found the car. It was half buried in the sand, its doors flung open. Inside were more signs of struggle, deep gouges on the seats and dashboard, as though someone or something had attacked the driver. A strange ashy residue coated the interior, and the radio emitted a faint, eerie hum, though the car's battery was long dead. While investigating the vehicle, Harlan noticed something odd. The shadows cast by the group didn't align with the sun's position. Some were longer than they should have been, others twisted at unnatural angles. He pointed it out to the others, and as they watched, the shadows began to move. Not theirs, but something else. Long, spindly shapes rose from the sand, stretching and coiling like living things. One by one, they began to take form, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were elongated, their heads featureless, except for faint indentations where eyes should have been. They moved silently, gliding across the sand as if weightless. The group ran. The trek back to town was a chaotic blur. The shadows pursued them relentlessly, the whispering wind carrying faint, unintelligible voices. Bill, the tracker, was the first to fall. He tripped and was enveloped in seconds, his screams muffled as the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him into the sand. Harlan and Rise didn't stop. They didn't dare look back. When they finally reached the outskirts of Dunewell, the shadows halted, retreating as though an invisible boundary held them back. Harlan and Reyes collapsed in exhaustion, the town's lights flickering faintly in the distance. The sheriff tried to report the incident to state authorities, but his calls were met with skepticism. A search team was sent to the Whispering Dunes, but they found nothing. No car, no signs of struggle, no shadows. The case was quietly closed, ruled as heat-stroke-induced hallucinations, but Harlan and Reyes knew the truth. The sheriff retired soon after, leaving town and refusing to speak of what happened. Reyes stayed, though she was never the same, her once vibrant personality dulled by the weight of what she had seen. Today, the Whispering Dunes remain untouched, a place the locals avoid at all costs. Travelers passing through Dunewell sometimes report strange sightings, silhouettes moving against the desert skyline, whispers that seem to come from nowhere, and a lingering sense of dread that grows stronger the closer one gets to the dunes. Those who linger too long are never seen again. In 2006, the small, rainy town of Crestwood became the center of a terrifying mystery that still haunts those who dare to speak of it. Crestwood was a quiet, unassuming place, surrounded by dense forests and crisscrossed with narrow, winding roads. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, or so they thought. It all began with a call to the Crestwood Police Department late one October night. A panicked woman named Diane Porter reported that her neighbor, an elderly man named Walter Greaves, had been staring at her house for hours from his living room window. He hadn't moved, not even blinked, and his face was eerily blank, as if he were in some kind of trance. Officer Darren Cole was dispatched to check on the situation. When he arrived, Diane greeted him at her door, trembling and clutching a flashlight. She pointed across the street to Greaves' house, where the old man was indeed standing by the window, his eyes locked on her home. Cole approached cautiously, knocking on the door, but there was no response. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. The house was cold and dark, a faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. "Mr. Greaves?" Cole called out, his voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. He moved through the rooms, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, until he reached the living room. Greaves was still standing at the window, completely still, his back to Cole. "Mr. Greaves, are you all right?" Cole asked, stepping closer. When he reached out to touch the man's shoulder, Greaves turned slowly, unnaturally, as though his movements were being controlled by invisible strings. His face was pale and expressionless, but his eyes were wrong. They were entirely black, like polished stones, and seemed to absorb the light from Cole's flashlight. "Why are you in my house?" Greaves asked, his voice low and distorted, like two voices speaking at once. Cole stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a coffee table. "Sir, I'm here to make sure you're all right. Your neighbor was concerned." "She shouldn't have been watching," Greaves interrupted, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Now she's seen too much." Before Cole could respond, Greaves collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing violently. Black liquid began to seep from his mouth and eyes, pooling on the floor. Panicked, Cole called for backup, but when other officers arrived minutes later, they found the house completely empty. There was no sign of Greaves, no black liquid, only Cole sitting on the floor, pale and shaking. The next day, Diane Porter disappeared. Her front door was left wide open, her car still in the driveway, but there was no trace of her. Inside her house, officers found something chilling. Every mirror in the home had been shattered, and in the shards scattered across the floors, faint black smudges that looked like handprints could be seen. Over the following weeks, more residents vanished. Each disappearance was accompanied by the same strange signs: broken mirrors, the faint smell of mildew, and occasionally puddles of that same inky black liquid. Rumors spread about shadowy figures appearing in mirrors, staring at those who lingered too long. The police were overwhelmed, their ranks thinning as officers either quit in fear or disappeared themselves. One officer, Detective Linda Marlowe, decided to investigate Greaves' house again, convinced it was the key to the mystery. She never returned. Her body was found days later, deep in the woods, curled in a fetal position. Her eyes were gone, her mouth open in a silent scream, and her hands clutching a small, broken mirror. After her death, the disappearances stopped, but Crestwood was forever changed. Many residents moved away, unwilling to live in a town where so many unanswered questions lingered. Those who stayed avoided looking into mirrors, especially at night. Some claimed to see fleeting shapes in reflective surfaces, figures that seemed to be watching, waiting. The house on Greaves Street was abandoned and eventually demolished, but locals say the land remains cursed. Travelers passing through Crestwood sometimes report seeing figures standing by the side of the road, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And every so often, someone brave or foolish enough to stop and look closer finds only their own reflection, staring back with impossibly black eyes. They don't stop again. In the summer of 2011, a chilling mystery unfolded in the quiet fishing village of Cold Harbor, perched on the rocky coastline of Maine. The town was known for its dense fogs and the mournful cries of distant buoys, but no one could have predicted the horror that would come to define it. It began with the disappearance of Jacob Stillman, the local lighthouse keeper. He was a solitary man, well-liked but known for his peculiar habits, often speaking of strange sounds carried on the ocean wind and shadows that moved unnaturally in the fog. When he failed to check in after a particularly heavy storm, a pair of local officers, Deputy Linda Haynes and Officer Mark Groves, were sent to investigate. The lighthouse stood on an isolated island, reachable only by a small motorboat. As Haynes and Groves approached, an eerie quiet enveloped the area. The usual sounds of seabirds and waves were muted, as though the very air was holding its breath. They docked at the island and climbed the slick, winding stairs to the lighthouse, where they found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick and damp, carrying the faint smell of salt and decay. The walls were scrawled with frantic writing, etched in what appeared to be soot and grease. The words repeated over and over, "It sees me. It sees me." On the desk, they found Jacob's logbook, open to the final entry. It read, "The fog isn't right. It moves wrong. It's alive. If anyone finds this, don't stay here. Don't let it touch you." They never found Jacob. The lighthouse was abandoned, and the incident became a local legend. But a month later, the fog returned, thicker and more impenetrable than ever before. Boats became lost just a few miles offshore, their crews turning up days later, drifting lifeless in the tide. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, eyes wide and mouths agape, but their bodies bore no signs of injury. Autopsies revealed only one abnormality. Their lungs were filled with a strange, thick mist. Deputy Haynes became obsessed with the case. She pored over Jacob Stillman's logbook and old maritime records, finding scattered accounts of similar incidents dating back over a century. Each time, the fog was described as unnatural, with survivors claiming they saw shapes moving within it, figures tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that pierced the gray veil. Haynes convinced Groves and a small team to return to the lighthouse to investigate. Armed with floodlights and recording equipment, they ventured into the heart of the fog. Their final radio transmission came at 3:17 a.m. "The fog. It's surrounding us. There's something in it. Oh God, it's everywhere. The transmission cut off abruptly. When search teams arrived the next day, they found the lighthouse empty. The recording equipment was missing and the motorboat was still docked at the island, but there was no sign of the team. On the walls of the lighthouse, new words had been scrawled in the same sooty substance. It watches. It waits. The fog lingered for weeks, spreading beyond Cold Harbor's shores. People began reporting strange occurrences in the village. Whispers coming from the sea, lights flickering in the mist, and shadowy figures appearing on the edges of the harbor. Some villagers claimed they felt something brushing against them when the fog rolled in, cold and slick like the skin of a deep-sea creature. Eventually, the fog lifted as suddenly as it had come, but Cold Harbor was never the same. Many residents moved away, leaving behind abandoned homes and shuttered shops. Those who stayed lived in fear, keeping lanterns burning through the night and avoiding the shore whenever the fog began to creep in. To this day, no one knows what happened to Jacob Stillman, Deputy Haynes, or the others who vanished into the mist. Sailors passing near Cold Harbor report seeing the lighthouse beam cutting through the fog, though the light has been decommissioned for years. They say if you look closely, you can sometimes see figures standing in the windows, motionless, their glowing eyes watching the sea. In 1979, the remote town of Ironwood, Montana, became the site of an incident so disturbing that it was quietly scrubbed from local records. Ironwood was a small mining community, its people tough and superstitious, shaped by generations of isolation in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. That winter, a series of bizarre and terrifying events began at the abandoned Hollow Pines mine. The mine had been shut down decades earlier after a collapse killed 23 workers, their bodies never recovered. Locals believed the mine was cursed, claiming to hear faint voices or see dim lights flickering in its depths on moonless nights. It was considered a place to avoid until a group of teenagers decided to explore it on a dare. The 4 teens, armed with flashlights and bravado, entered the mine on a frigid January night. Only one of them, a boy named Tyler Crane, returned. He was found wandering the outskirts of town, barefoot and delirious, his clothes soaked in a mix of sweat and freezing rain. He muttered incoherently about the men in the dark and refused to speak further before collapsing into a catatonic state. The sheriff's department launched a search the next morning. Deputies found the other 3 teens deep inside the mine. They were dead, their faces twisted in expressions of sheer terror. Strangely, their bodies bore no signs of injury or struggle, just wide, unblinking eyes and mouths frozen mid-scream. The search team also reported unsettling phenomena. Radios cut out the moment they entered the mine, replaced by faint static that some swore carried whispers. Flashlights flickered erratically, and several deputies claimed to feel unseen hands brushing against them in the darkness. When the sheriff called off the search, only half of the original team made it out unscathed. The others returned pale and silent, refusing to explain what they had seen. Tyler Crane was transferred to a state psychiatric hospital where his condition deteriorated rapidly. He began carving strange symbols into his skin with his fingernails and screamed incessantly about the watchers below every night. A week later, he vanished from his locked room, leaving behind only the words, "They see everything," scrawled on the wall in his own blood. The town descended into paranoia. Rumors spread about strange figures seen wandering near the mine at night, their forms shrouded in shadow, their movements unnatural. Livestock began disappearing, and people claimed to hear low, guttural chanting emanating from the mountains. Those who ventured too close to the mine often returned visibly shaken, muttering about eyes in the darkness that followed them home. One night, the mine's boarded entrance was found torn open, the wood splintered as though by something inhumanly strong. The following morning, the sheriff and his deputies entered the mine for what would be the last time. They never returned. Backup officers sent from a neighboring town found no trace of them, only the sheriff's hat lying in the dirt just inside the entrance, and the same symbols Tyler Crane had carved now covering the walls. After that, Ironwood was never the same. The townspeople began abandoning their homes, leaving the area eerily desolate. By the summer of 1980, the town was a ghost town, its streets overtaken by weeds and silence. Today, the Hollow Pines mine still stands, its entrance sealed with heavy steel plates. But hikers and campers in the Bitterroot Mountains report strange occurrences. Whispers in the wind, footprints that appear and vanish in the snow, and shadowy figures glimpsed just out of sight. Some claim to see dim lights glowing in the distance, deep within the mountain's veins, as if the mine itself is alive and still calling for more. In 1993, a chilling incident unfolded in the rural town of Black Hollow, Vermont, a place known for its dense woods and long winters. The story begins with a strange emergency call received by the Black Hollow Sheriff's Office. At 3:13 a.m. on a bitterly cold January night, a woman's voice whispered over the line, "They're at the windows. Please help us." Deputy Greg Mallory was dispatched to the address, a remote farmhouse miles from the nearest neighbor. The house belonged to the Fisher family, David, his wife Claire, and their 2 young children. The wind howled as Mallory navigated the icy roads, his cruiser headlights cutting through the darkness. When he arrived, the house stood eerily quiet, its windows dark and frosted over. Mallory knocked on the door, but there was no response. He tried the handle, finding it unlocked. Inside, the house was cold, as if the furnace had been off for hours. A faint smell of burnt wood lingered in the air. "Sheriff's Department," Mallory called out, but his voice echoed unanswered. In the living room, he found the source of the burnt smell. The fireplace was filled with ashes, but the firewood hadn't been burned. It was something else. Mixed among the ashes were fragments of strange, blackened objects. They looked like twisted sticks or bones, but none were recognizable. The unsettling discoveries didn't stop there. On the walls and floors were dozens of muddy footprints, too small for an adult and too large for a child. They seemed to come from every direction, converging around the windows. In the kitchen, the table was set for dinner, but the plates were untouched and the food was ice cold. A chair lay on its side, as though knocked over in a hurry. Then Mallory found the note. It was scrawled hastily on a piece of torn notebook paper, pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet. The handwriting was shaky, the words chilling. "They come in pairs. Don't look them in the eyes. They can't come inside unless you invite them." Mallory felt a cold dread settle over him. He checked the rest of the house but found no trace of the family. In the children's bedroom, the window was wide open, its curtains billowing in the icy wind. Below the sill, 2 small, muddy handprints were smeared on the wall. He called for backup, but as he waited outside the house, something caught his eye. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight, were 2 figures. They were tall and thin, with impossibly long limbs. Their faces were obscured, but their heads were tilted as though watching him. Mallory called out, his voice trembling, but the figures didn't move. Suddenly, the cruiser's radio crackled to life. It was a voice, a child's voice, soft and distorted, whispering, "Let us in." Mallory spun around, his heart pounding. The figures were now closer, just at the edge of the driveway. Their shapes were clearer now, their heads smooth and featureless. Mallory stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the ice, and scrambled into his cruiser. As he drove away, the radio continued to crackle, the whispers growing louder, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Let us in." Backup arrived an hour later, but the figures were gone. The Fisher family was never found. Over the following weeks, neighbors began reporting strange knocks at their doors late at night. Those who answered claimed to see 2 children standing on their porches, asking to come inside. But something was off about them. Their eyes were completely black, and their voices carried a strange, echoing quality. The stories spread quickly, and soon the townspeople began locking their doors and windows after dark. One by one, families packed up and left Black Hollow, unwilling to risk staying. By the end of the year, the town was nearly abandoned. To this day, the Fisher farmhouse stands untouched, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Urban explorers who visit Black Hollow often tell the same story. They feel watched the moment they step into the woods. Some claim to hear faint whispers in the wind, and a few have reported seeing 2 figures standing in the distance, their heads tilting unnaturally, as if deciding whether to approach. Those who stay long enough often find muddy footprints near their cars when they return, and if you're very unlucky, you might hear the soft knock on your door and the chilling words that follow, "Let us in."